$88,000 per capita, top 3 in the world. 90% of the land owned by the government. 90% of the population living in government-built housing. One political party, every single election for 66 years. 0 peaceful transfers of power, ever. What if the world's most celebrated economic miracle isn't actually a country? What if it's a corporation, with citizens instead of employees, and its foundations have an expiration date? Before you dismiss this as another rich country problem, here's what's actually on the line. 6.11 million people live inside this system. 77% of all households live in government-built apartments on leases ticking towards 0. The combined sovereign wealth funds, Temasek and GIC, hold an estimated $1.1 trillion, roughly 2.5 times the country's GDP. Citizens cannot access a single dollar without presidential approval. Singapore has been ranked the most expensive city in the world 9 times in 11 years. A basic Toyota costs $150,000 because the license plate alone runs $110 grand. The fertility rate has crashed to 0.97, below replacement, below Japan, below South Korea. And the 1962 water agreement with Malaysia, which supplies roughly half of Singapore's daily water, expires in 2061 with no renewal clause. Now, if this sounds like someone else's problem, consider this. Every trade-dependent economy, from Hong Kong to the Netherlands, is watching Singapore for a reason. The same forces threatening this city-state, geopolitical fractures, supply chain disruptions, hidden structural debt, are coming for all of them. It all started with a man crying on live television. August 9, 1965. Lee Kuan Yew, 41 years old, went on live television to announce that Singapore had been expelled from the Malaysian Federation. And he wept. The country was suddenly sovereign. No army, no natural resources, no domestic water supply. A hostile Indonesia waging confrontasi across the strait. GDP per capita, roughly $500. The population lived in kampongs, wooden shacks with open drains. On paper, this was a death sentence. Lee's masterstroke was turning vulnerability into strategy. Over 3 decades, he built a machine. The Economic Development Board, founded in 1961, aggressively courted multinational investment, making Singapore the easiest place in Asia to do business. The Housing Development Board, founded a year earlier, constructed over 1 million homes, moving the entire population from shacks into high-rise estates, binding them to the state through 99-year leases on government land. The Land Acquisition Act of 1966 enabled compulsory purchase at below-market rates. Government land ownership surged from 44% to 90%. National Service built a military from scratch. The Newspaper and Printing Presses Act gave the government control over every major publication. One government share overruled 200 private shares. And the opposition? Systematically neutralized. Operation Cold Store, February 1963, roughly 107 left-wing politicians and union leaders detained without trial. Chia Thai Po, held for 23 years, one of the longest political detentions in world history. Lee was explicit. He said, and I quote, "Between being loved and being feared, I have always believed Machiavelli was right. If nobody is afraid of me, I'm meaningless." The results were staggering. GDP per capita surged from $500 to $12,000 by 1990. Singapore became a high-income economy in the early 90s. The social contract was simple but absolute. The PAP delivers prosperity. You accept constrained freedoms. No independent judiciary to challenge land acquisition. No free press to question HDB valuations. No opposition strong enough to propose alternatives. The system worked, spectacularly, Because Lee understood something most leaders don't. If you control the land, the housing, the saving system, the media, and the narrative, you don't need to ban elections. You just need to make sure the alternative is unthinkable. One former foreign minister would later compare what Lee built to another small trading republic that once dominated the world. But we'll get to that. And for 60 years, the machine kept running. But here's what nobody tells you about the machine. Singapore's government doesn't just regulate the economy, it owns it. Temasek Holdings, a sovereign wealth fund whose CEO from 2004 to 2021 was Ho Ching, the Prime Minister's wife, controls Singapore Airlines, DBS Bank, Singtel, the electricity grid, all public transit, and the only television broadcaster. The government collects your retirement savings, builds your home, owns the land beneath it, and manages the media you consume. In any other country, we'd call this a command economy. And the company's returns? Underwhelming. Temasek's 10-year total shareholder return, 5%. The MSCI All-Country World Index over the same period, 9%. Canada Pension Plan, 9.2%. GIC's 20-year real return, 3.8%, its weakest since 2020. The Financial Times, December 2025, called the performance poor. Global SWF data ranked them, and I quote, among the weakest performers among 50 similar global organizations over a 10-year period. The government's defense? Reasonable given mandates and risk profiles. The citizens' question? Reasonable for whom? But ownership is just the beginning. The real trap is in the housing. 90.8% of Singaporeans own their home, highest rate in the developed world. Sounds incredible, but they don't own the land. Every HDB flat sits on a 99-year leasehold. When it expires, value drops to zero. Land returns to the state, no compensation. This isn't hypothetical. In December 2020, 191 terrace houses at Geylang Lorong 3 had their 60-year leases expire, the first residential properties ever returned to the state. Residents received nothing, and the value destruction begins long before expiry. Once a lease drops below 60 years, CPF usage becomes restricted. Below 35 years, banks refuse mortgages. Below 30, the flat is effectively unsellable. The government's answer? SERS, a program that buys back old flats and offers residents new ones. After 30 years, only 82 sites have been selected. That covers roughly 4% of total HDB stock, 43,000 flats out of over 1 million. In August 2025, the National Development Minister confirmed no further SERS projects planned. The replacement? Something called VERS, announced at the 2018 National Day rally. Not implemented. Earliest pilots slated for the early 2030s. Compensation, the government's own words, less generous than SERS, and only 5% of flats are even suitable. Meanwhile, 1,544 HDB resale flats sold for over $1 million in 2025, a record, creating the illusion that public housing always appreciates. For a working-class family in a 40-year-old flat with a declining lease, that narrative is over. Singapore's total fertility rate hit 0.97 in 2023, first time below 1.0, and it stayed there in 2024. Replacement is 2.1. The government tried everything. Baby bonuses up to $13,000 per child, doubled paternity leave, tax breaks. None of it worked. The trajectory tells the story. 1.9 in the 90s, 1.4 in the 2000s, 1.2 in the 2010s, 0.97 now. As of June 2025, 20.7% of citizens are over 65. Singapore has crossed the UN super-aged threshold. The old age dependency ratio has doubled since 2010. Sound familiar? Every developed country from South Korea to Italy is somewhere on this curve. Singapore is just further along than most. The immigration fix? Already pushed to the limit. 31% of the total population, nearly 2 million people, are non-residents, roughly 47% foreign-born. The 2013 Population White Paper projected 6.9 million by 2030. The response? The largest protest in modern Singapore history, 4,000 people at Hong Lim Park. Singapore imports roughly half its daily water from Malaysia's Johor River under a 1962 agreement that expires in 2061. The price, set 64 years ago, 3 Malaysian sen per 1,000 gallons. Former Malaysian PM Mahathir called it manifestly ridiculous and repeatedly threatened renegotiation. Singapore built 5 new water recycling plants and 5 desalination facilities. Impressive, but the math is brutal. The 1962 contract price is practically free. Desalination runs 250 to 450 times more expensive. Full water self-sufficiency by 2061 requires massive infrastructure investment, on top of $100 billion over a century for coastal protection against sea level rise. 30% of Singapore sits below 5 meters elevation. 3 time bombs, all ticking, all structural, and every one of them has the same root cause, which starts with the money they told you was yours. Here's the number that should terrify every Singaporean. 44%. That's the share of all CPF retirement contributions absorbed into housing. The government built a system where your mandatory retirement savings buy a depreciating asset on a shrinking lease, then told you it was asset enhancement. Roughly half of CPF members reaching 55 met the full retirement sum in cash. Those who do? They get about $1,780 a month, roughly a third of median income. Lee Kuan Yew, 2013. We intend to keep the value of these homes up. It will never go down. Let that sink in. Singapore didn't create a home ownership miracle. It created a retirement trap disguised as a home. And here's why no government, PAP or otherwise, can unwind this. Every solution you can think of, they've tried it. Everyone fails for the same reason. The system doesn't just create traps, it blocks the exits. The PAP has won every election since 1959. In 2025, under new Prime Minister Lawrence Wong, the first PM with no Lee family connection, the PAP took 87 of 97 seats with 65.57% of the vote. The Workers' Party won 10 seats, total opposition. But the system is structurally tilted. The group representation constituency system, introduced in 1988, forces opposition parties to field slates of 4 to 5 candidates. Massive resource barrier. Boundary redrawing? Controlled by the Prime Minister's office. No independent electoral commission. From 1988 to 2011, 58% of GRCs went uncontested. Then there's the defamation playbook. No PAP leader has ever lost a defamation action against an opposition leader in Singapore courts. Ever. JB Jeyaretnam, the first opposition MP since independence, was sued by 11 PAP cabinet ministers. $1.5 million in damages. Bankrupted. Chee Soon Hwan, bankrupted twice. $500,000 in 2002, $610,000 in 2008. Pritam Singh, leader of the opposition, convicted February 2025, removed January 2026. Here's the kicker. Even clean governance, the PAP's core brand, is cracking. Former Minister S. Iswaran was convicted in 2024 of accepting over $400,000 in gifts. The first ministerial corruption case in Singapore's history. If the party's legitimacy rests on incorruptibility, what happens when that's gone? Press freedom? Ranked 126th out of 180 by Reporters Without Borders. All major media government-linked. MediaCorp, 100% Temasek-owned. SPH Media Trust, $900 million in government funding over 5 years. POFMA, the fake news law, used 96 times and counting, overwhelmingly against opposition and independent media. By the way, Lee Kuan Yew's own younger son, Lee Hsien Yang, is currently in political exile in the United Kingdom, with asylum status, a critic of the system his father built. When the founding family itself fractures over the machine, that tells you something about what the machine has become. Now, imagine your family has a $1.1 trillion trust fund, but the rules say you can never touch the principal. You can only spend half the interest, and only if your father's appointed guardian approves. That's Singapore's sovereign wealth. Combined SWF assets, roughly $1.1 to $1.25 trillion, about 14 times annual government spending. Citizens can't touch them. The elected presidency, created in 1991, serves as the second key. Reserves have been drawn exactly twice, $4.9 billion during the 2009 financial crisis, repaid, and $40 billion during COVID, not repaid. Citizens benefit indirectly through something called the NIRC, up to 50% of net investment returns contributed to the annual budget. In 2024, that was $27 billion, the single largest revenue source, funding roughly a quarter of all government spending. But the framework preserves capital permanently. The reserves exist for future generations, a phrase that has meant every generation since 1991. 47% of the population is already foreign-born. Foreign workers make up roughly 40% of the total workforce. The CECA Free Trade Agreement with India, covering 127 professional categories, became a lightning rod for resentment. In 2021, slightly more than half of Singaporeans surveyed said immigrants take jobs from locals. Immigration as a solution? Already maxed out. And water self-sufficiency? At the 1962 contract price, new water costs 75 times more. Desalination, 250 to 450 times more. Daily demand, 430 million gallons, is projected to nearly double by 2065. Full self-sufficiency requires decades of investment, while simultaneously spending $100 billion on coastal protection against rising seas. The harsh reality is, the trap is geometric. Every solution creates a new dependency or cost that requires another solution. Hey, quick question for the comments. If you were a young Singaporean with a degree and a passport, would you stay and work within the system? Or would you be one of the 1,200 who leave every year? Let me know below. So what is Singapore, really? The answer might be the most unsettling thing about the whole story. Singapore is not a country that became a corporation. It's a corporation that became a country. And like any corporation, it can be disrupted. Remember that former foreign minister I mentioned? George Yeo explicitly drew the parallel to Venice, another small trading republic that dominated through strategic positioning, financial innovation, and diplomatic skill. Venice lasted 1,000 years, but its decline took 300, a slow hemorrhage of relevance as new trade routes bypassed it and nation-states outcompeted it. Yeo warned Singapore must avoid Venice's fate, leadership becoming insular, the system calcifying from within. The comparison that should keep Singapore's leaders awake at night. Hong Kong. In 2022, Singapore overtook Hong Kong as the world's third largest financial centre. Singapore now hosts 4,200 regional headquarters versus Hong Kong's 1,336. Capital fled south after China's 2020 national security law. But the moat is narrow. After the $2.3 billion Fujian money laundering scandal in 2023, family office applications from Chinese clients dropped roughly 50%. Money is flowing back to Hong Kong and on to Dubai. Singapore's reputation as a clean financial hub, the thing that differentiates it from every competitor, took its first serious hit. And then there's the question the numbers raise. The World Happiness Report puts Singapore at number 34. Finland? Number 1. Nordic countries prove an alternative exists. Comparable wealth, vastly lower inequality, genuine press freedom, consistently among the world's happiest citizens. Singapore's income Gini after transfers looks respectable, 0.359, record low. But the wealth Gini? 0.55. The top 20% of households averaged $5.3 million in net wealth. The country has 332,000 millionaires, 6.7% of all adults, 47 billionaires. Meanwhile, 60% of workers live paycheck to paycheck. Do the math. The question isn't whether Singapore can afford a welfare state, it's whether it can afford another 60 years of a system that produces wealth its citizens can't fully access. So what happens when the lease runs out, on all of it? Most likely outcome, the grey miracle. Lawrence Wong, the first PM without Lee family ties, has shown more populist instinct than his predecessors. Increased CPF grants, expanded housing supply, 55,000 new BTO flats for 2025 to 2027, led the PAP to an improved vote share. If the government addresses housing depreciation through VERS, pilots in the early 2030s, manages demographics through calibrated immigration, achieves water self-sufficiency before 2061 through new water and desalination, Singapore survives, but as a greyer, slower, more expensive version of itself. The machine keeps running, but the returns diminish. The miracle becomes maintenance. The second scenario, the supply chain break. US-China decoupling is forcing Singapore to choose sides. In April 2025, the US slapped a 10% tariff on Singapore. GDP forecasts were slashed to 0 to 2%. In September 2025, a 100% tariff on branded and patented drugs was announced, later delayed for Singapore pending negotiations, but it exposed the $3.1 billion pharma export vulnerability. Trade to GDP exceeds 300%. Any sustained disruption is existential. 90% of container throughput is re-exported goods. Add rising sea levels up to 1.15 meters by 2100, and the physical island itself is at risk. When your economy is a bridge, the worst thing that can happen is the two sides stop needing to cross. The dark horse, the Venice ending. The most dangerous scenario isn't collapse, it's irrelevance. If Dubai, Riyadh, or a resurgent Hong Kong captures the financial intermediary role, if supply chains restructure around Singapore rather than through it, if the best young Singaporeans keep leaving, roughly 340,000 are already overseas, about 1,200 renouncing citizenship every year. Singapore slowly becomes what Venice is today. A monument to a model that once worked. Beautiful, expensive, empty of the ambition that built it. Now, if you live in a city with rising property costs, aging demographics, and a government that promises growth will solve everything, you're watching a preview of your own future. Singapore is just further along the curve. Singapore isn't failing. That's the point. The most sophisticated traps never feel like traps until the lease runs out. And if you haven't seen our deep dive into South Africa's Rainbow Nation curse, why the country that inherited world-class infrastructure in 1994 has been systematically destroying it ever since, check it out. Links on screen. Now I want to hear from you. Drop your prediction in the comments. Is Singapore heading for the grey miracle or the Venice ending?